Welcome to Consciousness and the Bicameral Mind, the Julian Jaynes Society podcast. Learn more about Julian Jaynes' theory or become a member by visiting the Julian Jaynes Society at www.julianjaynes.org.
Welcome to another edition of the Savvy Street Show. I am your host, Vinay Kolhatkar. I have a distinguished guest. Today's guest is Marcel Kuijsten. So let me tell you something about him. Marcel is the founder and executive director of the Julian Jaynes Society. He has contributed to, edited, and published 3 books on the work of psychologist Julian Jaynes. And the 4th book, it's called Conversations on Consciousness and the Bicameral Mind, interviews with leading thinkers on Julian Jaynes' theory, and that will be published this summer. Welcome to the show, Marcel.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so the title of today's talk is Consciousness, Cognition, and Free Will, a Jaynesian perspective. So first, let me start by saying congratulations on the new book. What's different about this book compared to the previous 3?
Well, what I set out to do in this book was to present Jaynes's theory in a way that would be really understandable for the widest possible audience. And it occurred to me, we've been working on a documentary project. So we've been doing interviews, and a colleague of mine named Brendan Leahy had been doing interviews on the theory with different scholars. And I thought, why don't we present a book of interviews so people can learn about Jaynes's theory in a conversational format that's really easy for people to follow. And one of the things that comes up is that even people who have read Jaynes's book, they still tend to come away with a lot of different misconceptions. And so the goal of this book was to clear up a lot of the misconceptions, make the theory really easy to understand. We extend the theory into all kinds of new areas by talking to scholars in different fields. And we present a lot of new evidence for Jaynes's theory that's come out in the years since his book was published.
Thank you for that. I would say probably perhaps the most misunderstood part, if I could say that, of Jaynes's theory is his use of the word consciousness, which is the number one thing we're discussing today in consciousness, cognition, and free will. So let me offer here for our viewers a working definition of Jaynesian consciousness. I'll try to put it in 25 words. The ability of modern humans to create a conceptual model of themselves and of the world, enabling introspection, reflection, planning, fantasizing, and an autobiographical memory. Does that work for you?
Yeah, it does. I think that's a good way of approaching it. And it's just important for people that are new to Jaynes to understand that definition that you just presented. We're really essentially talking about humans' ability to introspect, to have this inner mind space that Jaynes talks about, where we can project into the future, reflect on the past, see ourselves in other situations. So we're not talking about things like visual perception that we share with all animals and basic cognition. A lot of what happens in our mental processing all happens outside of conscious awareness. So consciousness is this very narrow aspect of our overall mentality. And it is a stumbling block for people when they first encounter Jaynes, because they tend to come into it with these very broad, vague definitions of consciousness in mind that they've just internalized. One of the things that I do in the new book is to present the theory as 4 distinct hypotheses. And I think the feedback I've gotten from everyone is this has really helped clarify Jaynes's theory for people. So we have that first hypothesis that consciousness is based on language. The second hypothesis is his theory of what came before consciousness, this bicameral mentality. The third is the dating of this transition from bicameral mentality to consciousness. And the fourth is this neurological model he proposed for what might be going on in the brain. And each of those four hypotheses can stand or fall on their own. And by thinking about the theory in these distinct ways, we can really cut through a lot of the confusion that people have when they're first trying to understand Jaynes.
So what we're restricting our definition of Jaynes consciousness, or Jaynes to, is that part of consciousness which is unique to modern humans, not just humans, but very modern humans. Now, Jaynes says all the humans had a bicameral mentality. Now, we know physiologically today that the brain has two chambers, but it's still bicameral in that sense. But can you explain what a bicameral mentality is?
Sure. And I should point out, you mentioned modern humans have this type of Jaynesian consciousness, but it really is more narrow than that. It's modern humans with language. So we have a lot of other cases. For example, infants are not conscious in Jaynes's strict sense of the definition until they acquire language. Children who, for various circumstances, don't learn language. So there are other cases where people still don't learn this Jaynesian consciousness, and it is learned, and that's a key point in all of this. And as far as the bicameral mentality, what Jaynes discovered was that we learned this type of introspectable mind space much more recently in recorded history than was previously thought. So the question then comes up, well, what type of mentality did people have prior to developing introspection through complex metaphorical language? And what he found looking at ancient texts and looking through ancient history was that there was this mentality where people experienced their thoughts as coming from outside of themselves. So in ancient history, we see people who, in a decision point, experience a voice commanding their action, and they interpreted this voice often as a dead ancestor, a leader, a king, and eventually the gods. And much of behavior, we have to remember, is just habitual. And so this was just in stressful moments of decision-making where we might now stop and reflect and introspect. They heard this voice. So the bicameral mentality is this mentality in history where there was this God side and a human side, and neither side is conscious. The neurological model he proposed is a separate hypothesis, but related, and that is that as humans developed language, sometime between 50 and 100,000 years ago, the brain began to use language to communicate between the two brain hemispheres. This was his speculation. It couldn't be tested at the time, that perhaps the language areas of the non-dominant hemisphere were becoming active in what today we would call an auditory hallucination. And this was transmitting experience and information to the dominant left hemisphere through language, which was this new technology that was great at transmitting information. So that's the neurological model for the bicameral mind, that the brain hemispheres in the past were less integrated than they are today, and that information was being passed between the hemispheres via language, with today what we'd call an auditory hallucination. And it was just 20 years ago that we began to see these speculations about this neurological model being validated using fMRI studies of modern people who hear voices. And we see this right-left temporal lobe interaction during auditory verbal hallucinations.
Okay, now let's go back 3 to 30,000 years ago. And we are in this bicameral mentality, and most people are hearing the voices of authority. But, and maybe it's my bias here for the way I am, which is the way you are, and all of us modern humans with language are, we reflect on things. So in the past, didn't somebody whether they be kings or religious leaders, reflect on something to formulate a morality that was then passed down in generations? Or was the initial morality derived, like in a primate society, by instinct? Because otherwise we get an infinite regression problem.
We tend to think that all of these things are based on deep reflection and introspection, but I think it was Richard Dawkins, among others, who talked about this idea that we have this view that without religion, for example, we wouldn't have anywhere to go to get our ethics and morality. But in actuality, a lot of this is very instinctual. And we see the roots of a lot of modern human morality in primate behavior. And so, just to give one example, this idea of reciprocity that is so built in to our society and culture, and we think of these things as happening as we are civilized and educated, that we learn to reciprocate with people. But we see in primates this same type of behavior, and primates that don't reciprocate are ostracized. And we could go through a lot of the other types of things we attribute to modern morality and find that, in fact, these things are deeply instinctual and genetic. And so language comes along and we start to express these genetic impulses linguistically for the first time. And we start to codify them, and things like Hammurabi's code and whatnot are very instinctual type of ideas. And so these kings or high priests that would have the hallucinations that dictated the actions of the entire community were just their own right hemisphere hallucinations that were then communicated verbally, just as we would do today. And the people lower in these hierarchies would just be hallucinating their personal God, commands related to their day-to-day life. And so a lot of what we attribute to philosophical type of thinking actually goes back much, much farther in human evolution.
So, I could perhaps liken it to a pre-conceptual mentality, because to form concepts explicitly, we got to be having a monologue with ourselves first, which also helps us to have a dialogue with other people. Now, seemingly all that changed roughly maybe 3,000 years ago, but Jaynes talks about a cognitive explosion in ancient Greece. And is he attributing that to the rise and emergence of Jaynesian consciousness?
In Greece, we see some of the best evidence because we have the most writing of this, like you said, cognitive explosion that took place as the result of this new conscious mentality. And there's a lot of what Jaynes talks about is the consequences of consciousness. And one of those things that's very important is the newfound ability to spatialize time. We can, for the first time, a bicameral person could understand sequences of events and have environmentally cued behaviors and things like that. But for the first time, we can really project ourselves into the future and see ourselves in other scenarios, reflect on the past. And what we see in ancient Greece is really the birth of the idea of history as a subject of study. And Jaynes cites a historian named Chester Starr. His book is titled The Awakening of the Greek Historical Spirit. And it's just an interesting idea that history actually came into being around this time. And we had the first historian, Herodotus. So that was one of the aspects. Jaynes also talks about a two-tiered theory of emotions. So we have our more non-conscious emotions, things like fear, shame, anger, affiliation with others leading to mating. But then when we learn consciousness acting on those first tier emotions develops a conscious tier of emotions. So consciousness acting on fear you develop anxiety. With shame, which we see in many animals, it develops into the conscious concept of guilt. Fear, if with an animal, if you remove the frightening stimulus, they just go back to normal. It's humans that have ongoing anxiety about things. Anger with consciousness becomes hatred, and affiliation becomes the conscious emotion of love. So all of this stuff is emerging around this time. We see the beginnings of things like science, philosophy, and theater. Theater was not possible in the bicameral time in the modern sense. You can't have actors without consciousness. Along with this, you can't have complex deceit without consciousness, because it requires you to have this inner mind space where you imagine yourself doing things outside of your immediate behavior. Also related, Jaynes talks about this explosion in this time period of sexual fantasy, where prior to this, in the bicameral period, Greek art was extremely chaste. And then suddenly we see this explosion of art filled with sexual themes. As with consciousness now, we go beyond simple mating behavior and have this concept of sexual fantasy for the first time in history. And so all of these exciting things were taking place around this time, 800 BC in ancient Greece.
Okay. I wanted to bring not a concept so much as a speculation on the part of a fairly famous philosopher. Her name was Ayn Rand. You and I are both familiar with her. She speculated that we may be still evolving as a species. She'd spoken more about a anti-conceptual mentality as against a pre-conceptual mentality. And this Jaynesian hypothesis kind of leads me to say, well, a biologist might say, on the basis of paleontologists might say, okay, Homo sapiens came by 160,000 years ago. Where's the missing link? But here's the missing link in a way, because through those 160,000 years ago, the early humans were much more like a big-brained hominid. And perhaps only in the last 30 to 30,000 years, we've become the modern humans we are today. And then there were these stages where the kind of mind or the mentality was evolving, perhaps in a cultural, gene cultural way rather than a biological way. And maybe that's not being scrutinized, but it's a possible hypothesis.
Yeah, what you're getting at is also this thing we've inherited from Darwin's theory of evolution, that consciousness is simply an inherited trait that comes along as an adaptation once brains reach a certain level of complexity. And it's just an unquestioned assumption that we adopted, that consciousness is biologically based. And Jaynes really hit on this idea that no, it's something that we learn. It's something that requires language, and we learn it through metaphors of the physical world, creating this inner mental space. And it follows from that like any learned skill, it is variable. There are different features of consciousness. It's not an all or nothing proposition. It's not one spectrum, but maybe we could talk about maybe 10 different features of consciousness, perhaps more. And a lot of this remains to really be fully elucidated and explored. And so there are differences that we see even up through the Middle Ages. Reading a book recently by Roy Baumeister called The Self-Explained, and he talks about how the concept of the self has changed through the Middle Ages to this modern era we're in now. And the self concept was another thing that emerged in ancient Greece with the emergence of consciousness. And Professor Tanya Luhrmann, an anthropologist at Stanford University, is interviewed in the new book. And she's done a lot of interesting research on cross-cultural differences in theory of mind. And the way people experience consciousness does differ in different cultures around the world, but because it was just assumed for so long that this was all the same and it was innate, these things are just really beginning to be explored. And I think it's really interesting to see all these kind of differences. And it's especially evident in cases where you have people who don't learn language. It makes the case especially clear that there are very different measurable differences in the features of consciousness versus those who learn language. And when I say learn consciousness is a little bit strange sounding at first because it happens invisibly to us. It's not like we sit down and like learning a musical instrument and something that we practice. It just happens naturally in childhood as we learn language, immersed in a conscious culture. But it is something that is taught to each successive generation.
I want to emphasize here, we're still talking about Jaynes or Jaynesian consciousness, the uniquely human ability to introspect and make use of that introspection to reflect on the past and to plan the future. And that's the ability that is learned. And one really can't talk with oneself without language as the fundamental tool. I mean, I can't say, how can you introspect without language if you don't have language? What are you talking to yourself with? Just perhaps visual symbols.
It's not only the thing that creates this inner mind space, but language is also the tool, it's the vehicle that we can tie our thoughts to. And it allows us to hold ideas, complex ideas in our mind that we simply couldn't without language as this vehicle. And we can think about what our life would be like without language and just kind of do our own short experiment and just try to go as long as you can without any linguistic thought. And what you find is you can have, basic impulses like hunger, fear, things of that nature, but it's hard to go much beyond that without language in order to talk to ourselves. If we think of it as using interpersonal communication, but it is also how we communicate within ourselves as well.
Jaynes mentions one of his famous quotes is the language is an organ of perception. And I kind of thought maybe we could modify that to language is the organ of conceptualization.
I think that's right.
But if we are learning how to introspect culturally, it's a kind of a gene culture co-evolution rather than a strictly Darwinian process, then there must be differences around the world. And there have been remarkable differences around the world in economic progress, in the sense of individuality in different cultures. And the less individualistic cultures have been more backwards. Could we possibly attribute that to the lack of Jaynes?
Yeah, and I was jumping a little ahead earlier in saying that people like Professor Lerman are starting to look at this in different cultures around the world. Of course, if we look at studies of pre-literate societies, we see all kind of vestiges of bicameral mentality interacting around the world that are different from our Western conception. And eventually, I think these things could be measured, the different features of consciousness, but it gets quite complicated because, as I said, it's not a single feature. When we talk about things like on a university entrance exam of mentally rotating geometric figures in one's mind, and those kind of things could start to get at measures of this internal mind space, but that would just be one of the features. So different cultures vary in the way they teach and learn consciousness, and different individuals vary in the way they've internalized it, depending on things like their home environment, their educational experiences, reading and literacy, and all these kind of things are a factor. And eventually we might have a better understanding and way to measure many different features of consciousness. And you can have some people that excel in one area and have deficits in another area. But it is a new idea for people that this has variability. In my own life, I have a friend who has a non-linguistic, or well, I should say minimally linguistic child. And so it gives me an opportunity to observe someone that hasn't developed all of the features of consciousness that Jaynes talks about, who is very intelligent, very social, and can accomplish many, many things, but doesn't seem to have this ability of an analog eye, narratizing in a mind space that can project into the future, reflect on the past, and all of these different kinds of things. So it is quite fascinating to observe these things.
And where are we with, are there still cultures that reflect that lack of J-Con today, or we sort of gone past that?
Well, I think there was a time that it was thought that there were no more uncontacted pre-literate societies in the world today. But as the internet came along and more information was available, shockingly, there are still a few of these groups that have had almost no contact with modern civilization whatsoever. There's several groups living on the Andaman and Nicobar Islands in the Indian Ocean. They've resisted all outside contact. There are several uncontacted, or let's say minimally contacted tribes in the Amazon. And there's a real opportunity here with recently contacted tribes for anthropologists to study the vestiges of bicameral mentality, the features of consciousness, all of these kind of things. But the window of opportunity for this type of research is really rapidly closing. And it's just not work that is on the radar of most people because, of course, they're not always familiar with Jaynes's theory. There's a book about the Piraha called Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes, where someone documents some of these interesting differences that we see in some of these groups. But of course, he's not looking at it from the perspective of Jaynes's theory. But nonetheless, there's some insights that can be taken away from that.
So if we now say historically most cultures inculcated a self early in life among children, perhaps to let them self-regulate to the societal edicts, but in fact, isn't it true that that ability set us free? It gave us free will as we know it today, and there are still perhaps cultures that humans don't have a classic free will because they can't introspect and they can't talk with themselves.
Right. And the concept of free will gets into some very in-depth philosophical debates. And also in the new book, there's a real interesting discussion of the more philosophical aspects of free will and determinism. But we won't address that here today, but it is quite an interesting subject. But if we assume, for the sake of our conversation, that we do have free will, Jaynes doesn't really delve into that too much in his book, but in a later lecture, he's relating it to some other ideas, and he talks about this gap that we have between stimulus and response, and that is where all of our freedom essentially lies. In all non-human animals that don't have this introspectable mind space, they don't have this opportunity between stimulus and response to stop, reflect, and choose a different behavior. Their behavior is all based on genetics and habit and stimulus response. So consciousness, as we learn it, as we develop an introspective mind space, allows us to stop and deliberate our actions. And of course, there's a wide variability in how much people take advantage of that and how much people develop that skill within themselves. But it's something that anyone can further develop throughout their lifetime if they choose to.
Yeah, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there, because I liken that to short-term free will, the gap between stimulus and response. I mean, we do have time. Sometimes we don't. But even when we don't, I mean, there's a theory that we can program our subconscious through conscious thinking using Jaynesian human consciousness, so that our automatic actions in the future are also kind of a function of our long-term free will, which again, I think animals and, bicameral humans didn't have.
Absolutely. They didn't have that ability to reflect. It was a commanding voice that was immediately obeyed. And for people that are maybe a little bit skeptical hearing all this for the first time, it's good to remind them that, again, something that's discussed extensively in the new book is that there's so much more we know now about this experience that people have even today of hearing a commanding voice. And many, many, many more people around the world in all different cultures experience auditory verbal hallucinations, some of them to the point where they seek medical help, they have a clinical diagnosis. Many people who don't, who have a good, even positive relationship with a externally perceived guiding voice. But many people experience these voices as behavioral commands, even today. So this is all a vestige of this bicameral mentality that doesn't really have another explanation if we don't have Jaynes's theory. Why are millions of people today still hearing commanding voices that direct their behavior? But as you said, that was absent in bicameral times. And there's a lot of strategies today that people can engage in to try to further develop their consciousness. I hope to explore that more in the future, things like meditation, self-hypnosis, neurofeedback, and different types of mental visualization practices that people
you mentioned millions, but aren't there even billions potentially? Somewhere around half the world's population, or a bit less than that, are, to use a funny phrase, hypnotizable or can be hypnotized. And they're responding to an external auditory voice as though it's a command, and finding a raw potato tastes like chocolate or something like that.
There is a lot of discussion in the new book of hypnosis, and I speak to some of the world's leading experts on hypnosis, and discussion of hypnosis as a possible vestige of the bicameral mind. And hypnosis is still somewhat of a mystery, but the question is, at the most fundamental level, why is it that we seem predisposed to follow an external guiding voice? And why does hypnosis exist at all? These are real mysteries. And without Jaynes's theory, there's just not much to explain it. People seem predisposed through hypnosis and just in general to seek out authoritative guiding voices.
Yeah, that's key actually. Yeah, even those who don't seek hypnosis all the time do seek religious cult leaders or religion or some other authorial voice rather than deciding it for themselves. Let's now turn to cognition, if I may, because Jaynes makes what I think are kind of paradoxical statements. There is the cognitive explosion in ancient Greece, which is attributed to the rise of consciousness, but on the other hand, he says cognition is not directly related to consciousness. And my kind of reaction to that was the bicameral human did not land on the moon. There was an explosion of scientific and industrial progress as well. So explosion in cognition. Was that correlated to Jaynesian consciousness? Perhaps because there was an explosion also in the ability to write, in writing, and therefore codify a lot of complexity. By that I mean abstractions upon abstractions, like the language itself or mathematics is just pure abstractions. And you could codify scientific progress and store it. And so you were always, on the shoulders of giants like Isaac Newton. If you have to always reinvent, most of us could never reinvent what Newton did. Is that where the correlation is? Yeah.
That's exactly right. Writing is extremely important in all of this. And writing is also a factor in likely what led to this transition from bicameral mentality to consciousness. It was one of the key factors, along with metaphorical language, social complexity, and other factors. But like you said, without writing as a way to store and distribute information, we would have very limited ability to progress technologically. So that was definitely something that was critical to this sudden advancement that we see starting around 800 BC in Greece and other places. And for people who come from this traditional idea that consciousness is very old, sometimes people talk about the modern mind starting with the emergence of cave art 50,000 years ago and things like that. You have to step back and ask yourself, why did it take another 49,000 years for all of these interesting things like philosophy, science, mathematics, theater to suddenly emerge if consciousness is indeed 50,000 or 100,000 years old? It just doesn't really make any sense. It was Jaynes that really saw that there was such an important transition that took place much more recently in history, and we can see the beginnings of all these things at that time. He explains, by the way, how things like cave art are completely non-conscious behaviors, that art even today is largely a non-conscious process. We see there's a case of an autistic 3-year-old child that I talk about in the book who was documented to draw beautiful cave art-like drawings, and she had no language ability. So it really debunks this idea that cave art is this hallmark of the modern mind. Writing, consciousness, all of these things coalescing is what led to future technology finally starting to emerge.
And could it be that even with all the great benefits we have of the uniquely human consciousness, there is, in some aspects, a slowdown? I mean, we watch that in infants. I've seen that in my own daughter as well. She was remarkably good at the concentration game under the age of 3, and then she slowed down. So it's like this ability to introspect got in the way of what was otherwise instinctive cognition.
Yeah, there's a tremendous amount that we were able to accomplish non-consciously. A tremendous amount of problem solving takes place outside of conscious awareness. Even to this day, there's many examples of scientists and physicists and mathematicians who are ruminating on a problem, and it's only after a period of sleep or other recreational activities that suddenly the solution appears to them, and it was solved non-consciously. So it is a trade-off. They talk about that in the case of Nadia, where as she did eventually learn language, her artistic ability began to diminish. So was that related? We can't say for sure, but it does seem that as we learn consciousness and also as we acquire more and more technology that does a lot of our thinking for us, certain seeming by today's standards sort of miraculous abilities that we had in the past become diminished. And talking about the Homeric literature and the Iliad, for example, which was sung by these Greek bards for centuries, they were memorizing extremely long epics, and they had certain memorization techniques and tools that they used and anchors and whatnot. But I think it would be very difficult for someone today to do that kind of memorization. And so certainly we see trade-offs, but anything that we introspect on now, even complex solutions, could have possibly presented themselves during the bicameral mentality in the form of a hallucination. And we see documentation of very complex commands in the ancient world to build a temple, for example. I refer to this again in the book. People can look at the details there, but people who received visitation dreams to build a temple and then subsequent dreams with very detailed instructions about how to go about that. And these kind of visitation dreams, requesting and giving construction specifications, continued into the Middle Ages with various monks and things like that. So it's quite fascinating, all the things that people experience during these visitation dreams, which are just another side of the waking bicameral experience.
It's quite a phenomenal canvas, isn't it, for future research. is there some kind of limit of maybe it's political correctness in academia that, now we are sort of the fourth decade after Jaynes, but perhaps not enough research is being done on what are sort of numerous ways of looking at a variety of things.
Yeah, and we have to remember what the climate was like when Jaynes published his book. We were coming out of this period where behaviorism was the dominant school in psychology. Consciousness, for the better part of the 20th century, was completely dismissed as something that simply couldn't be studied. So to publish a book on consciousness at that time was very groundbreaking. Even when I was looking at doctoral programs about 20 years ago, the idea of studying consciousness was really dismissed. I was told it wouldn't be something that you could really do full time. You had to pursue things that you could get grant support for. fMRI and other brain imaging technologies that have come along have kind of ushered in a new interest in studying consciousness because they can see the brain in action. But in a lot of cases, they're still approaching consciousness in what I view as the wrong way. They're using these broad, vague definitions, and often they're looking just at mere reactivity and awareness and things like that. So part of the problem was this bias against studying consciousness, which is slowly beginning to change. Part of it is the problem in consciousness studies itself, where they lack the terminology and vocabulary to really accurately describe all of these things. Consciousness is used as an umbrella term for all kind of mental activity. And I make a reference in the book that the state of affairs in consciousness studies is almost like what it would be like if we were trying to follow recipes and cooking instructions, and if all the fruits and vegetables were just simply referred to as produce. That's really, I'm joking, but it's really kind of what things are like in consciousness studies. And then the other factor is this bias that we already touched upon, that consciousness is something that's biological, it's innate, and we try to minimize individual differences in people and differences in cultures. And that was a big problem in anthropology for a long time. Even in looking at pre-literate societies, the insinuation that there were differences psychologically was almost seen as something that was like racist or something like that. But it really doesn't have to be. And I think these are important things. And there can be a real benefit from overcoming these hurdles, because if we as a culture begin to recognize that consciousness is something that is learned, it's something that's taught to each successive generation, then perhaps we can start teaching it more effectively. We can start identifying these factors, and we might teach it better, or at least teach it more uniformly. So there's certainly a lot to be gained by understanding these insights that Jaynes had. Real practical insights.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more. It's a very, very rich field for research and study. And so I want to conclude on that happy note. Hopefully that kind of research does happen, and more people get acquainted with Jaynes in terms of reading his book, and also the 4 books that you've written, and there have been a few others. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, I think there's tremendous opportunities for research in this area. And so any aspiring scholars that are listening to this can look at Jaynes's theory and find so many rich opportunities for research. And I really appreciate you having me on to talk about the theory today.
Thank you. Appreciate you coming along. So we'll conclude for now. Bye for now. We might have Marcel again sometime in the future.
Thanks for having me.